Welcome to Battletech Legends and Mechs, a short story podcast telling tales from around the Inner Sphere and beyond. Good day, everyone. Let's see if we can get through today's class without starting a brawl. Not that I don't enjoy a good scrum as much as the next retired mech jockey, but I did decide to try and get a PhD for a reason. Mostly self-loathing, if I'm being honest. I'm sure there are other reasons to get a doctorate, but be damned if I have one. As always, my name is Marks, and this is Tutorial Section 1 for the Professor's History of the Inner Sphere. This week we're going to be taking a bit of an apocryphal dive to our lore, but just because it's not canon doesn't mean it isn't awesome. Besides, a lot of the possible history we know eventually becomes formally ratified into actual history when some scholar posts exactly the same information everyone else has always known, but does so in a peer-reviewed fashion. So let's talk about the little slice of the Periphery known as the Aurigan Reach. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, the Reach is a section of space that exists in the no man's land between two big Periphery states, specifically the Magistracy of Canopus and the Taurian Concordat. Two important notes here. When I say big Periphery state, note that I mean big for the Periphery and not like actually big. The Magistracy controls around 40 systems at one time, and the Taurians claim to about 50 to 60. Compare that to the Capellans, the smallest of the great houses, with their paltry 200 or so systems, and you get an idea of the scale we're working with. But, as the Taurians would be quick to point out, just because they're not as large as the Inner Sphere government doesn't mean they're not big enough for your mother. Taurians are like that. Anyway, so we have two Periphery states that have come to blows a few times, because if the two of them were to unite, they would be legitimately the same size and power as one of the successor states. Trouble is that the two governments are radically opposed on both political and social levels. The Concordat is a constitutional monarchy with heavy isolationist tendencies and an inclination towards violence if anyone glances towards them. In their defense, they have been invaded more times than ancient Poland, which is a statement of some weight. And since they never signed the Ares Conventions, they have been at the frequent receiving end of nuclear, chemical, and biological warfare attacks. Across a few dozen star systems is the Magistracy, which has an entirely elected government, a thriving vacation economy, and which values individual freedom over almost all other considerations. The Taurians see the Magistracy as fat and lazy. The Magistracy sees the Concordat as iron-booted fascists, and both are armed well enough to make everyone else's life miserable. If only there were some kind of, buffer state. A nation, much like the Rasselhag Republic, which lays between these two violent neighbors, that would resist invasion from either side, so everyone can go back to happily ignoring each other because if either side attacks, they have a second front to worry about. And usually, most military planners know that fighting more than one direction at a time is, from a tactical perspective, what we like to call a really bad idea. And thus, House Arano and the Aurigan Coalition. Now, I'm going to assume that many of you are already familiar with the highly popular and extremely good holovid recreation of a little portion of House Arano's history, but for those of you who aren't familiar, just go and play it. It's one of the best, if not the single best, strategic simulation of being a mercenary mech warrior ever made. It's spectacular, and there are mods that allow you to do all sorts of crazy stuff with it, but even without the mods, it's still pretty gosh darn good. Also, everything I'm saying from this point now until the end of the lecture includes massive spoilers, so if you want to play the holovid with fresh eyes, skip the rest of this lecture. Okay, with that out of the way, let's continue. The Aurigan Coalition was an alliance of approximately 20 star systems that formed around the mid-2800s and lasted until at least the end of the Fourth Succession War, and potentially much longer. They were a minor power even at the height of their strength, and their only real contribution was to keep two slightly less minor powers from each other's throats. Oh, and for clarity, the sector of space referred to as the Aurigan Reach, but the government is the Aurigan Coalition, but I use the terms interchangeably. So why should we care about the Reach? Well, you don't have to care at all, I suppose. But the reason that I care is that the Aurigan Coalition is a very clever little encapsulation of Inner Sphere politics wrapped in pretty red and gold ribbon. There's backstabbing, political machinations, war crimes, cover-ups. It's just glorious. And proves once again Sun Tzu's maxim that spies are the most important things in warfare. Sorry, that's the original Sun Tzu I'm quoting, although I suspect that the Liao one would agree with the statement. Anyways, let's discuss the history of the Aurigan Civil War. In 3022, a brief and highly successful coup d'etat occurred in the Aurigan coalition, and the new Aurigan Directorate formed, replacing the existing head of government, the High Lady Kamea Arano, with Director Santiago Espinosa. There's more to it than this, but basically it was time to crown Lady Arano, and so all the lords of the major houses in the Reach were on Cormadir for the ceremony. House Espinosa snuck military dropships into the system, while their technicians sabotaged as many of the forces loyal to House Arano as possible, so that when they launched their attack it was swift, brutal, and extremely effective. Overnight, the Aurigan coalition, and almost all support for House Arano, was wiped out. After a few years hiding with her relatives in the Magistracy, Lady Arano returned and launched an aggressive campaign to reclaim her throne. After a few early successes, Lady Arano uncovered some startling evidence of the Directorate abusing its power, locking up political prisoners in a death camp. Using this to leverage political favor with the population and to curry support from the founding houses of the coalition, Lady Arano and her army of the Restoration continued to strike at the Directorate. The plan was to free each of the coalition's founding houses from direct control from the Directorate military forces. In order to secure the support of House Carosas, the Restorations had to destroy a dropship responsible for smuggling weapons to the Directorate. Excuse me, I should say a dropship claimed to be smuggling weapons for the Directorate. Ordered to stand down, the dropship captain refused, and the Restoration destroyed it, killing the crew and whoever else happened to be aboard. Coalition historians claim it was a smuggler ship, too heavily armed and armored for any civilian transport. The Taurian Concordat has given no indication that it was smuggling for them, although few governments will ever actually acknowledge directly financing smuggling operations at any point. Why does it matter what the Taurians think? Well, very quickly, the Directorate began fighting back against the Restoration using weapons far beyond the capabilities of House Espinosa's private military. Even as Espinosa increased military budgets and spending, the sheer scale of the forces brought against the Restoration was far beyond worst-case predictions. The Restoration was winning every engagement and still losing the war through slow attrition, while the Directorate seemed to have a constant supply of fresh troops and mechs whenever and wherever battle was joined. To make matters worse, a Taurian commodore named Ostegard began hounding Lady Arano for her role in the destruction of the potentially smuggling dropship. Turns out his son was the captain of that ship, and whether he was smuggling or not mattered little to Ostegard. He just wanted Arano's head on a platter, and was willing to use the full power of his Fortress-class dropship, named the Iberia, to do it. Ostegard completely obliterated House Camosa from orbit, and in the process pushed the Restoration and its army into a corner. Lady Arano scrambled the mercenary forces to various hotspots around the Reach, using them to keep the Directorate off balance and unsure where she'd appear. Finally, through political maneuvering and espionage, the Restoration found evidence that proved Espinosa himself ordered a civilian massacre in Taurian space, and then blamed it on the Magistracy in order to curry political favor with the Taurians. The Taurians immediately withdrew their official military support from the Aurigan Reach, but Ostegard refused to leave without killing Lady Arano first. Instead, Lady Arano's mercenaries managed to upload a computer virus to the Iberia as it burned hard to catch the Aurigan Restoration's forces. The ship's engines died, although only for a few minutes. Turns out that if you're already close to maximum thrust when your engines quit, well, to quote a great man, an object in motion tends to stay in motion unless an outside force is applied. In this case, the object in motion was a Fortress-class dropship named the Iberia, and the outside forces applied was the surface of Cormadir. High Lady Arano reclaimed her throne, but the aftermath of the war left scars, both actual and socioeconomic, on the coalition and its people. The Aurigan military in particular was in tatters, and every world had been touched, if not torched, by the war. A period of desperate rebuilding was launched, and ironically or tragically, the reformed coalition retained many of the changes imposed by the short-lived Directorate as emergency measures. From here on out, we transition from mostly canon into completely unknown. The official history of the Aurigan coalition stops sometime around 3029, at the start of the Fourth Secession. That's not to say the coalition itself stopped, but they no longer appear on any official star charts. That might be a political move by their enemies. The whole Aurigan Civil War was, to a large extent, directly caused by the Taurians' unwillingness to recognize them as an independent political entity. It's certainly not impossible that future star charts, financed by Comstar of the Great Houses, may have intentionally suppressed further information about House Arano and the Aurigan Reach as a concession to the Concordat. See, the original charter that formed the coalition started outside, but directly adjacent to the Concordat, and during their expansion, they claimed several worlds that were claimed by, but not administered by, the Taurians. Kamea's father, Tamati, was attempting to negotiate terms with the Taurians for a peaceful transfer of power, but his unwillingness to impose a dictatorship on the Aurigan people resulted in Espinosa seeing him as weak. The Directorate immediately imposed the dictatorship, and as a result was able to strike favorable terms with the Taurians. Although that was only possible because Espinosa made Protector Cauldron, newly appointed head of the Concordat, believe that House Davian was responsible for a massive terrorist attack known as the Perdition Massacre, a chemical weapons attack that killed 11,000. I mentioned earlier that Espinosa blamed the Magistry for this, and it's important to note that the Davians and the Magistry are considered buddy-buddy enough that to the Taurians, it was one and the same. In the aftermath of the war, the Restoration found itself with an economy in ruins, planets reduced to smoking rubble, and almost no military remaining. The Taurians were looking for an excuse to invade, to peacefully return lost planets to Concordat rightful rulership. The Magistry couldn't directly support the Aurigans, even if they wanted to, because it would be seen as specifically provoking a military buildup along a paranoid Taurian border, and none of the other houses really cared that much about a tiny periphery state in the first place. Enter the Aurigan Irregulars. This, for the record, is not what they were actually called, but for the whole host of reasons that I think will be made clear, I'll be referring to them as that in the future. Basically, Lady Arano needed her military forces brought up to strength as quickly as possible, and so she dispatched both her prized military force and several ex-House Arano regular battlemech pilots throughout the Periphery and Inner Sphere to track down and retrieve any battlemech that was, quote, lost during the Civil War when pilots started going AWOL. If the pilots came back, great. But with or without the pilots, the Aurigan Reach needed those mechs. I think that'll do it for this week, since I've already rambled on longer than usual. As I mentioned, I love the Reach, and its scrappy can-do attitude. I love the color of their mechs, I love the Atlas II that Lady Arano claimed for herself, and I love that in the end, the war was won by both battlefield capabilities, but also a critical spy network and some very fancy lost-at computer virus. Just great stuff all around. Next week, I think the professor's lecture is on tactical warfare, so I may spend some time with the little brown book that Jamie Wolfe translated. It's a classic, in the most extreme sense of the word. As always, I would like to thank Catalyst Games for their generous stewardship of the Battletech property, and you guys are doing great work. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can reach me at marx.battletech@gmail.com. I also haven't thanked Joel Morelli for his phenomenal music recently, and I would like to do so again because it continues to be really good. Thanks, Joel. Until then, have a great couple weeks, and I'll see you all for the next lecture. Class dismissed.